The scorching summer sun beat down on the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, a small settlement nestled between rolling plains and distant mountains in Wyoming Territory, 1878. The town had sprung up around a silver mining operation some 15 years prior, and though the silver had mostly played out, the town persisted through ranching, farming, and serving as a supply point for travelers heading further west. At the edge of town stood a weathered farmhouse belonging to Thomas Blackwood, a man whose calloused hands told the story of a decade spent coaxing life from the unforgiving soil. He sat on his porch, pipe clenched between his teeth, watching the horizon with eyes as faded blue as his work shirt, the lines around them etched deep from years squinting against the western sun. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know what city you're watching from. Thomas was known throughout the county for his stubbornness, which had served him well in establishing one of the most successful farms in the territory, despite droughts, blizzards, and the occasional locust swarm. His wheat fields stretched toward the horizon, a golden testament to his relentless work ethic. But for all his success with crops, Thomas's life was marked by solitude. His wife Sarah had passed during a harsh winter 7 years earlier, leaving him alone with memories and a house too quiet for comfort. The locals often remarked that Blackwood was married to his land now, and he'd done little to dispute the notion. The clatter of an approaching wagon drew Thomas's attention. It was Dr. Franklin's rig, kicking up dust as it made its way down the rutted road toward town. The doctor slowed as he approached, tipping his hat. "Afternoon, Thomas. Crops looking mighty fine this year." Thomas nodded acknowledgement, a man of few words since his loss. "Heading to the Miller place," the doctor continued, clearly uncomfortable with silence. "Eleanor Miller's been under the weather. Town's buzzing about her, you know. Widow for nearly a year now. And doing her best to keep that ranch going." Thomas's expression remained impassive, though something in his eyes shifted at the mention of the widow. Eleanor Miller had arrived in Redemption Creek 3 years prior with her husband James, a cattle rancher with grand ambitions. They'd established a modest spread about 5 miles from Thomas's farm, and for a time, it seemed they might prosper. Then came the winter of '77, brutal even by Wyoming standards. James had gone out to check on stranded cattle during a blizzard and never returned. His body wasn't discovered until the spring thaw revealed what the locals had already suspected. The West claimed many men who underestimated its harshness. Eleanor had surprised everyone by announcing she would continue running the ranch rather than selling and returning east. The townspeople admired her spirit, but whispered that it was only a matter of time before reality forced her hand. That evening, as Thomas finished his solitary supper, Sheriff Wade Holbrook's knock interrupted the silence. The weathered lawman stood awkwardly on the porch, hat in hand. "Thomas, I need to ask a favor." Thomas gestured for him to continue, suspicion evident in his narrowed eyes. "It's about the Miller widow. Doc says she's got a bad case of influenza. She's laid up, and those cattle of hers need tending. I know it's not your business, but you're the closest neighbor with experience handling livestock, just until she's back on her feet." Thomas stared into the distance, his jaw working silently. Finally, he gave a single, curt nod. "I'll head over at first light," he said, the words seemingly pulled from him against his will. Dawn had barely broken when Thomas hitched his wagon. He packed supplies, anticipating a day's work at minimum. The ride to the Miller Ranch took him through a landscape awakening with golden light, casting long shadows across the rolling terrain. As he approached the modest ranch house, He noted with a critical eye the sagging fence lines and overgrown paths, signs of a property struggling without sufficient hands to maintain it. Yet the cattle looked surprisingly healthy, testament to Eleanor's determination, if not her experience. Thomas tied his team to the hitching post and approached the door, an unfamiliar discomfort settling in his chest. He knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet morning. After a long pause, the door creaked open to reveal Eleanor Miller, clearly weakened by illness, but standing nonetheless. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple braid, her face pale, but her green eyes alert and wary. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice hoarse, "Sheriff Holbrook mentioned you might come." Thomas nodded, suddenly finding words elusive under her direct gaze. She was younger than he remembered, perhaps 30 to his 45 years, with a quiet dignity that caught him off guard. "The cattle need water and moving to the north pasture," she continued, filling his silence. "I'd be grateful for the help." Thomas cleared his throat. "You should be resting, ma'am. I'll see to the stock." She looked as if she might argue, then swayed slightly on her feet. "Thank you," she conceded, turning back into the house. Thomas spent the day working the Miller Ranch, moving cattle, repairing the worst sections of fence, and clearing an irrigation ditch that had become clogged with debris. The work was familiar, almost comforting in its demands on his body rather than his mind. Occasionally, he caught himself glancing toward the house, wondering how the widow fared. As the afternoon sun began its descent, he approached the house again, intending to report what he'd accomplished before heading home. This time, Eleanor answered his knock more steadily. Some color returned to her cheeks. "You've done more than I expected, Mr. Blackwood. Please, come in and have some coffee before you go." Her invitation surprised him, but he found himself stepping across the threshold before he could consider declining. The interior of the Miller home was modest but well-kept, with simple furniture and a few Eastern touches that spoke of the life Eleanor had left behind. A porcelain figurine on the mantel, a framed needlepoint displaying a verse from Psalms. Thomas sat awkwardly at the kitchen table while Eleanor prepared coffee, the domesticity of the scene highlighting how long it had been since he'd shared space with another person. "The north fence still needs work," he said abruptly, breaking the silence. "Won't hold if a steer leans hard against it." Eleanor set a steaming cup before him and took the opposite chair. "I know," she sighed. "There's always something more that needs fixing. James had plans to hire help this year." The mention of her late husband hung in the air between them, a shared understanding of loss that required no elaboration. They drank their coffee in surprisingly comfortable silence until Thomas finally spoke again. "I'll come back tomorrow. Finish the fence." Eleanor studied him, her green eyes searching his weathered face. "Why would you do that, Mr. Blackwood? We barely know each other." Thomas stared into his cup, unable to articulate his reasons even to himself. Finally, he shrugged. "Being neighborly, I suppose." A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Well then, I thank you for your neighborly concern, and please, call me Eleanor." Thomas nodded, feeling something unfamiliar stir within him, a sensation he'd thought long buried with his Sarah. "Thomas," he offered in return, before rising to take his leave. True to his word, Thomas returned the next day and the next. Each day, Eleanor grew stronger, eventually joining him outside to help with lighter tasks, her determination evident in every movement. They fell into an unspoken routine, working side by side during the day, sharing simple meals in the evening. Words between them were few, but purposeful, each gradually revealing fragments of their lives before Redemption Creek. Thomas learned that Eleanor had been a schoolteacher in Pennsylvania before marrying James and following his dream west. She discovered that Thomas had fought for the Union, then wandered westward after the war, unable to return to a home that no longer existed except in memory. As summer progressed, Thomas found himself dividing his time between his farm and Eleanor's ranch, neglecting neither, but stretching his days from dawn well past dusk. The townspeople noticed, of course. Little escaped observation in Redemption Creek. Gossip flowed freely at Hank's Saloon and Martha's General Store. Some approved of the arrangement, seeing practical sense in two lonely people helping one another. Others, particularly those who considered themselves guardians of propriety, began to whisper about impropriety and unseemly haste. Sheriff Holbrook, overhearing such talk one afternoon, silenced it with a hard stare. "Those two have known more sorrow than most. Leave 'em be." His words carried weight, though they didn't entirely stop the whispers. One evening in late August, as Thomas and Eleanor sat on her porch, watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in crimson and gold, she turned to him with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Thomas, I need to discuss something with you." Her serious tone made him tense, fearing she was about to end their arrangement. "The bank in town, Mr. Harrington came to see me yesterday while you were working the North Field. He says I've fallen behind on the loan payments James took out last year. He's given me until the end of harvest to settle the debt, or he'll begin foreclosure proceedings." Thomas's hands tightened on his chair arms, a surge of protective anger rising in him. "How much?" he asked simply. Eleanor named a sum that made his breath catch, nearly all his savings from the past 3 years. They sat in silence as darkness fell, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue. "I won't lose this place," Eleanor said finally, her voice soft but steel-edged. "James is buried here. This land is all I have left of him, of our dreams together." Thomas nodded, understanding completely. "There might be a way," he said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. "My wheat crop looks to be the best I've had. With both our yields combined, and if prices hold—" He trailed off, calculating mentally. Eleanor turned to him, her expression a mixture of hope and wariness. "That would mean a partnership of sorts." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "It would." The word hung between them, laden with unspoken implications and possibilities. The next morning, Thomas rode into town earlier than usual, his destination the office of Hiram Jenkins, Redemption Creek's only lawyer. The conversation was brief but consequential, resulting in documents that Thomas carefully folded and placed in his pocket before heading to the bank. His meeting with Harrington was considerably less pleasant, the banker's oily smile fading as Thomas laid out his proposal in blunt terms. "The widow Miller and I are forming a partnership to work both properties. Her debt will be restructured accordingly." Harrington sputtered objections about regulations and bank policy until Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "You've been hoping she'd fail so you could snatch that land cheap. We both know it. That's not happening now." Harrington paled slightly, then forced a tight smile. "Very well, Mr. Blackwood. I'll draw up the new terms." When Thomas returned to Eleanor's ranch that afternoon, he found her in the barn, examining a sick calf. She looked up as his shadow fell across the doorway, her expression questioning. Wordlessly, he handed her the papers from Jenkins. She read them carefully, her eyes widening. "A formal business partnership? Thomas, this is—" She trailed off, searching for words. Fair, he supplied. Your land, my additional labor and capital. We split the profits after your loan is cleared. Eleanor studied him, her gaze penetrating. This is a significant commitment. Are you certain? Thomas nodded once, decisive. I am, if you are. She extended her hand, and they shook firmly, sealing the agreement with the simple gesture. Neither acknowledged the current beneath their practical arrangement, the unspoken possibility that hung in the air between them. Harvest season arrived with its punishing schedule and physical demands. Thomas and Eleanor worked from before dawn until after dusk, sometimes by lantern light, bringing in first his wheat crop and then her smaller cornfields. They hired temporary help from town, including young Billy Jenkins, the lawyer's son, worked with surprising diligence for a 16-year-old. The combined yield was even better than Thomas had hoped, and when the final wagons were unloaded at the grain merchants, the payment received was enough to satisfy Harrington's immediate demands, while leaving a modest surplus. That night, exhausted but triumphant, they celebrated with a special dinner Eleanor prepared, allowing themselves the luxury of genuine optimism about the future. As autumn painted the countryside in russet and gold, Thomas and Eleanor settled into their partnership with growing ease. They maintained separate households, but shared meals most days, dividing tasks according to their strengths. The practical arrangement worked well, with Eleanor handling the accounts and correspondence, while Thomas focused on the physical labor and planning for the next planting season. Neither spoke openly about how their relationship had evolved beyond mere neighbors or even business partners, but the townspeople had no such reservations. Speculation ran rampant, with betting pools established at the saloon regarding when Thomas might formally court the widow. The first snow fell early that year, blanketing the land in pristine white. Thomas arrived at Eleanor's ranch one morning to find her struggling to break ice on the cattle trough. Without comment, he took the axe from her hands and completed the task while she fed the chickens that huddled in their coop against the cold. Later, as they warmed themselves by her kitchen stove, Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. Winter's setting in hard. Been thinking it doesn't make sense to maintain two households through the cold months. He stared fixedly at his coffee cup. Waste of firewood, supplies, practical to consolidate. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly at this pronouncement. Are you suggesting we should share a home, Thomas? The directness of her question made him flush beneath his weathered tan. For practical reasons, he clarified hastily, though they both recognized the inadequacy of the explanation. Eleanor regarded him thoughtfully, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Indeed, very practical. And which home would we consolidate into? Thomas hadn't thought that far ahead. Yours is smaller, easier to heat, he reasoned aloud. But mine has the larger barn for the stock. Eleanor's smile broadened at his obvious discomfort with the conversation. Perhaps we should consider a trial arrangement, she suggested, to determine which is more practical. Thomas nodded, relieved at her pragmatic approach, yet acutely aware of how their practical decisions were leading them towards something neither had openly acknowledged. The trial arrangement began that week, with Thomas bringing essential belongings to Eleanor's ranch, while the first serious blizzard of the season howled outside. Sharing space created an intimacy beyond their previous interactions. From the quiet rituals of breakfast preparation to evenings spent reading by the fire, Eleanor with her novel, and Thomas with the Farmer's Almanac, occasionally reading passages aloud to one another. The practical arrangement had emotional consequences neither had fully anticipated. Christmas approached, bringing with it a rare social obligation, the annual holiday gathering at the church in Redemption Creek. Neither Thomas nor Eleanor had attended the previous year, both too raw in their grief, but this year declining would raise more questions than attending. They arrived together in Thomas's wagon, causing a momentary lull in conversation as heads turned and whispers erupted. Eleanor wore her best dress, a deep green wool that complemented her eyes and chestnut hair. Thomas, uncomfortable in his seldom-worn suit, nevertheless stood tall beside her, a silent statement to the community about their alliance, whatever its exact nature. Pastor Mitchell greeted them warmly, his wife Martha even more so, effectively setting the tone for the evening. Most townspeople followed their lead, treating the couple with cordial respect, though Thomas didn't miss the speculative glances and hushed conversations that followed them throughout the evening. The new year of 1879 arrived with brutal cold and snow piled high around the ranch buildings. Thomas and Eleanor settled into a winter routine, tending to essential chores while planning improvements for both properties once spring arrived. During the long evenings confined by weather, they began to share more of their histories, their hopes, their disappointments. One night, as wind rattled the windows and snow hissed against the glass, Eleanor spoke of her marriage to James, his dreams, his kindness, but also his recklessness that had ultimately cost him his life. "He wanted children so badly," she said softly, staring into the fire. "We tried for 2 years before coming west. The doctor in Philadelphia said there was something wrong with me, that I'd never conceive." Her voice grew even quieter. "James said it didn't matter, but I saw how he looked at families in town. It mattered." Thomas was silent for a long moment, weighing whether to share his own closely held pain. "Sarah and I had a son," he finally said, the words feeling strange on his tongue after years of silence on the subject. "He died with her during the birth. He would have been 7 now." Eleanor reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, a gesture of such simple compassion that Thomas felt his throat tighten. They sat that way for a time, connected in their losses, until the fire burned low and they retired to their separate rooms, though something fundamental had shifted between them. The next morning, breakfast was prepared and eaten in a silence different from their usual comfortable quiet, charged with unspoken emotions and possibilities neither was quite ready to articulate. As January gave way to February, Thomas received a letter that disrupted their careful equilibrium. His brother Robert, whom he hadn't seen in nearly 15 years, had died unexpectedly in Illinois, leaving Thomas as guardian to a niece he'd never met, 12-year-old Margaret. The girl would arrive by train in 2 weeks. Thomas paced Eleanor's kitchen, the letter clutched in his hand. "I know nothing about raising a child, especially a girl," he said, uncharacteristic panic in his voice. Eleanor watched him with a mixture of sympathy and something harder to define. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. Thomas stopped pacing, meeting her eyes directly. "I don't know. Return to my farm, I suppose. This arrangement," he gestured vaguely, encompassing their shared domestic space, "wouldn't be proper with the girl here." Eleanor was silent for a long moment, then spoke with careful precision. "Unless it was proper." Thomas stared at her, uncomprehending. "What do you mean?" Eleanor took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. We could marry before the girl arrives. The blunt proposal hung in the air between them. Thomas's expression shifted from shock to something more complex. Eleanor, that's not why I mentioned the situation. I wouldn't want you to feel obligated. She shook her head firmly. It's not obligation, Thomas. Our partnership has worked well. This would simply extend it. Her practical framing couldn't quite mask the emotion in her eyes. And perhaps we both deserve a second chance at family. 3 days later, they stood before Pastor Mitchell in the small church, witnesses limited to Sheriff Holbrook and Martha Mitchell. Eleanor wore her green dress again, Thomas his Sunday suit. The ceremony was brief, the words traditional. But as Thomas placed a simple gold band on Eleanor's finger, purchased hastily from Martha's general store, something profound passed between them, an acknowledgement that their practical arrangement had become something neither had dared hope for again. They signed the marriage certificate with steady hands, accepted the congratulations of their witnesses, and drove back to the ranch, their home now, officially and permanently, in a wagon laden with Thomas's remaining possessions from this farm, which would now be worked alongside Eleanor's ranch as truly shared property. That evening, as husband and wife sat before the fire in their home, a new awkwardness descended upon them. For all their months of partnership and weeks of shared living space, this final boundary remained uncrossed. Thomas cleared his throat. I should check on the stock before turning in, he said, rising from his chair. Eleanor caught his hand. Thomas. Just his name, but the way she said it stopped him instantly. She stood to face him, green eyes meeting blue with unwavering directness. We've been practical about everything else. Let's not be foolish about this. She took a step closer. I may not be able to give you children, but I can be a wife to you in every way. Thomas swallowed hard, his calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. Eleanor, it's been years since... She silenced him with a finger to his lips, then replaced it with a kiss. Their first. Tentative at first, then with growing certainty. Young Margaret Blackwood arrived 2 weeks later, stepping off the train with wary eyes and a single carpet bag containing all her worldly possessions. Thomas and Eleanor met her on the platform, both nervous but determined to make the girl feel welcome. Margaret was small for her age, with her uncle's blue eyes and a seriousness that spoke of recent grief. Uncle Thomas? She asked hesitantly. Thomas nodded, suddenly at a loss for words. Eleanor stepped forward, smiling warmly. And I'm Eleanor. We're so glad you've come to live with us, Margaret. The girls studied them both, then addressed Thomas with disarming directness. Father said you were a hard man who ran from family. Are you going to send me away too? Thomas knelt to meet her eyes, finding his voice. No, Margaret, your family. You'll stay with us as long as you wish. Spring arrived early that year, bringing renewal to more than just the land. The Blackwood Farm and Ranch, now operated as a single enterprise, flourished under the combined efforts of Thomas, Eleanor, and surprisingly, young Margaret, who took to farm life with unexpected enthusiasm. The girls' presence changed their household in countless ways, from the school books that now littered the table to the sound of laughter that had been absent from both their lives for too long. Thomas watched one afternoon as Eleanor patiently taught Margaret to make bread. The two heads, one chestnut, one blonde, bent together over the dough. Something tightened in his chest at the sight, a fullness he'd thought never to experience again. That night, as they lay in the darkness of their bedroom, Thomas whispered, "Thank you," against Eleanor's hair. She turned in his arms. "For what?" His answer was simple, "For betting on us." As summer heat settled over the land once more, Eleanor fell ill with a persistent malady that Dr. Franklin initially diagnosed as a mild stomach ailment. When it didn't abate after 2 weeks, Thomas insisted she return to the doctor's office in town. Margaret accompanied them, her concern for her new aunt evident in her solemn expression. They waited anxiously as Dr. Franklin examined Eleanor behind the privacy screen in his office. When the examination concluded, the doctor emerged with an expression Thomas couldn't interpret. "Mrs. Blackwood will be just fine," he announced, a smile breaking through his professional demeanor. "Though she'll need to take things easier these next 7 months or so." Thomas stared uncomprehendingly until Eleanor emerged, tears streaming down her face despite her radiant smile. "Thomas," she whispered, taking his hands, "I'm with child." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, now a family of 3, soon to be 4, Eleanor leaned against Thomas's shoulder. "Remember what I told you that night by the fire? That I couldn't have children?" Thomas nodded, his arm tightening around her. "The doctor in Philadelphia was wrong," she continued softly. Or perhaps, she placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Perhaps some bets are meant to be won." Thomas felt a smile, still unfamiliar, but increasingly natural, spread across his face. "I always was stubborn," he murmured, drawing both Eleanor and Margaret closer, as the western sky blazed with promise. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound carrying across the land that had witnessed their losses, their courage, and now, against all odds, their renewal.